The desert had a way of remembering things. It remembered every hoofbeat, every drop of blood, and every whisper carried by the wind. That evening, when the sun began to sink behind the jagged mesas and painted the sky in copper and rose, the wind carried something different, something heavy with the scent of returning. The people of Dry Creek hadn't spoken his name in years, yet when they saw the lone figure riding from the horizon, every heart in town seemed to stop at once. 10 years had passed since he had vanished into the wilderness. 10 long years since the Apache warrior had ridden away without a word. The old saloon doors creaked as the stranger rode by, his shadow long across the dirt road. The folks who remembered him didn't dare to speak, though their eyes followed his every move. He wore the same dark hair tied behind his neck, the same sharp eyes that once held more fire than the desert sun. But now, there was something quieter in them, something that made even the wind pause before brushing against his face. Time had changed him, carved him into something harder, something unreadable. Still, to those who had known him, he was unmistakable. Inside the general store, a woman stood frozen by the window, her hand pressed against the glass as if to make sure he was real. Her breathing quickened when she saw the mark on his arm, the mark she thought she'd never see again. For a moment, everything around her went still, and only the sound of his horse's slow steps filled her ears. 10 years had passed since that night when the fire had torn through the valley and taken everything she loved. 10 years since he'd promised to return and right the wrongs that had burned their lives apart. Out near the edge of town, the wind swept over the graveyard hill, stirring the dust from forgotten stones. There, beside the oldest oak tree, a small cross stood, with a name carved faintly into it, one that still carried weight in whispers. It was a name that tied him to this place, a name that had bound him to a past no one dared to speak of. Yet as he dismounted and walked through the main street, his boots pressing into the earth that had once known his blood, it was clear he had come for more than memories. The sheriff stepped out from his office, his hand hovering close to the worn leather of his holster. "You're far from your lands," he said, his voice rough with caution. The stranger said nothing, only met the sheriff's gaze with a calm that unsettled even the lawman himself. He wasn't the same reckless warrior from the old tales told around the campfires. There was a stillness in him now, the kind that came only from years of silence and survival. Children peeked out from behind wooden fences, their mothers pulling them back gently. The air in town thickened, heavy with something unspoken. Everyone knew the story, though time had softened its edges. The Apache warrior had once fought alongside the settlers when raiders threatened Dry Creek. He'd saved lives, built trust where none had existed. But when the conflict turned brutal, when revenge replaced reason, he had vanished into the desert's embrace. Some said he'd been hunted, others whispered he had turned on his own kind. Whatever the truth, it had been swallowed by the sand and buried with the years. Now he was here again, his silence speaking louder than any gunfire. He tied his horse to the rail outside the saloon and stepped inside. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses stilled in midair. The piano man's fingers froze over the keys. Every face turned toward him, measuring him, fearing what his return might mean. From the far corner, a man with a scarred cheek stood up, his drink trembling slightly in his hand. "Didn't think we'd see your kind again," he said, his voice half challenge, half fear. The warrior's eyes met his, calm and steady. "I came for the truth," he said quietly.
The words were simple, but they struck harder than a bullet.
Outside, the woman from the general store stood near the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent years building a quiet life, raising a son who had never known his father's face. She told herself the past was gone, that the desert had swallowed it whole. But now, with that single glance, the truth she'd buried so deep began to rise again. The stranger's presence rippled through Dry Creek like a dust storm, slow, steady, unstoppable. The older folks remembered his loyalty, his courage, the night he'd risked his life to save the settlement. But others remembered the fire, the blood, the betrayal that followed. Some said he'd been the cause of it all, that his people had come for revenge, and he'd vanished to escape the guilt. Whatever had happened, the town had paid the price. As night fell, the streets emptied. The lamps flickered low, and the desert began to hum with its lonely song. In the saloon, whispers circled like restless ghosts. The sheriff sat across from the warrior, the air between them heavy with 10 years of silence. "You're stirring up old bones," the sheriff said finally. Ain't much left to dig up." The warrior looked down, his voice low but steady. "Then maybe it's time to bury what's left the right way." From the window, the woman watched them, her hand clutching a small silver pendant, the only thing she'd kept from that night. It gleamed faintly under the lamplight, a reminder of a promise once made beneath the endless desert sky. The pendant had belonged to him, a token of a bond that neither time nor pain could erase. And as she watched him now, she knew he had come not just for truth, but for something more, a reckoning long overdue. Far out in the desert, thunder rolled softly across the horizon, though no storm clouds could be seen. The sound echoed through the canyons, like the beating of distant drums. It was as if the land itself was remembering, preparing. The warrior felt it in his bones, the call of unfinished business, of promises not yet kept. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, his eyes met hers across the dusty street. For a heartbeat, the years fell away. No words passed between them, but in that single glance, everything unspoken was laid bare: the pain, the loss, the truth that had been buried for a decade. Her eyes shimmered with tears, not from fear, but from recognition. He had come back, and with him came all the ghosts she had tried to forget. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, long and mournful. The sound lingered, wrapping around the town like a warning. The warrior turned his gaze toward the hills, where the moonlight carved pale lines across the sand. He knew the truth he sought was waiting there, buried beneath years of silence and lies. And he knew that when it came to light, nothing in Dry Creek would ever be the same again. The sheriff watched him go, the woman still standing in the doorway, the wind tugging at her hair. The townsfolk peered through cracks in their shutters, whispering prayers or curses, unsure which would be needed first. The air grew colder, the night quieter, as the warrior disappeared into the dark, following the path only he could see. 10 years had passed since he rode away from this place, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and shattered hearts. But now, as he vanished once more into the shadows, it wasn't escape that drove him. It was the truth. When he found it, someone's piecer, someone's lie would finally be broken. The woman stepped back from the doorway, her voice trembling as she whispered to herself, "He's really come back." Then she turned toward the small room behind her where a young boy slept under the soft glow of a lantern. The boy's features, even in sleep, carried the unmistakable shadow of the man who had just ridden into town. And in that quiet moment, she knew the past wasn't done with her, not yet. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest echo of distant drums. Somewhere in the dark, the Apache warrior rode toward the truth that had waited 10 long years to be found. And when the sun rose over Dry Creek again, the desert would remember everything. The night was still when he left town, only the faint sound of his horse's hooves breaking the silence. The moon hung low, its pale light guiding his path toward the distant hills. He rode slow, not from weariness, but because every rise and shadow carried a memory. The desert had a way of speaking to those who listened, and he'd learned long ago how to hear what others ignored. 10 years had passed, yet nothing truly changed. The wind still whispered secrets, and the stars still watched like silent witnesses. But somewhere out there, beneath the sand and stone, lay the truth he had returned for. Behind him, Dry Creek tried to settle back into its quiet rhythm, though nothing felt the same. The saloon lights dimmed early, the laughter that once spilled from its doors replaced by hushed talk. Some folks claimed the warrior's return meant trouble, that old grudges never stayed buried. Others said it was justice finally catching up after too long. Either way, nobody slept easy that night. Inside her small house near the edge of town, the woman sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the fading trail of dust he had left behind. The boy stirred in his sleep, murmuring softly, and she turned her gaze to him. He was growing fast, with that same stubborn spark in his eyes. She had always known this day might come, though she'd prayed it never would. She had built a life on silence, on carefully chosen lies that protected more than just herself. But now with him back, silence felt like a weight she could no longer carry. She remembered the first time she had seen him years ago, when the town was barely more than a cluster of shacks and dreams. He had come from the south, wounded and silent, carrying the weight of war and loss. Most folks hadn't trusted him back then. He was Apache, and trust didn't come easy in those days. But she had seen something different in him, something that wasn't just survival. He had a calm way of moving, a quiet strength that drew her closer before she even realized it. He had helped build the fences, guard the wells, and teach the men how to track during the raids. He earned the respect of people who once feared his kind. But peace never stayed long in Dry Creek. One summer night, the hills had caught fire, and before dawn, half the town lay in ashes. The blame came fast and heavy, fueled by fear and grief. Rumors spread that the Apache had turned on them, that he had betrayed those he'd once sworn to protect. When he vanished the next morning, the story sealed itself. What no one knew was what had really happened that night. Only she carried the full truth, locked deep where no one could reach it. And now that he had returned, that truth stirred restlessly inside her, waiting for its time to surface. Out in the hills, the warrior stopped by an old creek bed long dried by time. The faint outline of stone still marked where a small fire had once burned. He knelt down, brushing his fingers over the earth. It was here that everything had changed, where loyalty and betrayal had clashed under the same burning sky. He could still see the glow of the flames, hear the shouting, smell the smoke. That night had stolen everything: his people, his peace, his name. He had wandered far since then through the deserts of Arizona, the plains near the Rio Grande, and the mountains where the stars looked close enough to touch. He had carried his silence like a weapon, learning patience from the land. But now, the trail had led him back, and the time for silence was ending. He heard a rustle behind him. A man stepped out from behind a mesquite tree, his rifle half raised. "Didn't think you'd come back," the man said. It was the scarred one from the saloon. His voice carried a mix of bitterness and fear. "You've got a lot of nerve showing your face here after what you've done." The warrior didn't move. "I came for answers," he said simply. "Answers? We buried those long ago," the man snapped. "Ain't nothing left but ghosts and graves." The warrior's gaze stayed steady. Then it's time the ghost spoke. The man hesitated, lowering his gun slightly.
"You think the truth will fix what happened?"
"You can't bring back the dead, no," the warrior said, "but I can stop the lies." The scarred man's eyes flickered with something, maybe guilt, maybe fear. He spat into the dust and turned away. "You'll wish you'd stayed gone," he muttered, disappearing into the darkness. The warrior watched him go, his heart heavy with what he already suspected. Lies had been built here, layer by layer, until they'd become the foundation of Dry Creek itself. Breaking them would break the town too. But some things needed breaking before they could heal. Back in town, the sheriff sat in his office, staring at an old wanted poster pinned to the wall. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded, but the name still burned clear in his memory. He'd been younger then, hungrier for order, more willing to believe what he was told. He'd hunted the Apache warrior once, believing it was justice. But now, seeing him return, something in him stirred uneasily. Maybe justice hadn't been what he thought it was. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned back, the wooden chair creaking beneath him. Out the window, the lamplight from the saloon flickered in the wind. He knew tomorrow the questions would start, and he wasn't sure he was ready for the answers. The next morning, the town woke to a silence that felt different. The warrior's horse stood tethered near the old stable, its coat glistening with early dew. He sat on the porch outside the blacksmith shop, sharpening a knife that looked older than most of the men who passed by. No one dared speak to him, but they all watched. The whispers started again where he'd been, what he wanted, who he'd come for. The woman avoided the main street that day. She went about her chores with trembling hands, though her thoughts never left him. A side made her flinch, fearing what the day might bring. By noon, she finally walked out to the well, her heart racing with every step. When she looked up, he was standing across the street, watching her. Their eyes met again, and for a moment, time folded back on itself. He didn't speak, but she knew what that look meant. It wasn't anger or accusation it was searching. He was still looking for something only she could give. That night, the sheriff came knocking on her door. He looked tired, older than he had the night before. "He's asking questions," he said quietly. "About the fire, about that night. You knew him better than anyone. What's he after?" We looked down, her fingers twisting the silver pendant she still wore. "The truth," she whispered. "Truth can be a dangerous thing," the sheriff said. You tell it wrong, it can burn worse than lies. She met his eyes then, her voice steady. It already did. He left her standing there, the door open to the cool night air. She stepped outside, staring at the empty street. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust. Just like the night, everything changed. Somewhere a dog barked, then went quiet. The warrior stood near the edge of town, his silhouette outlined against the dying firelight. He could feel the tension thick around him, the weight of a story that had been buried too long. He knew not everyone wanted the truth to surface. There were men in Dry Creek who had built their peace on his silence, and peace built on lies never lasted. He walked toward the graveyard hill before dawn. The sky was still dark, the stars fading slow. He stopped before the old oak tree and knelt by the grave that bore the name tied to his past. Placed a small carved token beside a Theta circle with a line through it, a symbol of balance and return. Then he whispered something in his native tongue, a promise carried by the wind. As he rose, a shadow moved behind him. The faint click of a rifle echoed in the stillness. He didn't turn. If he came to finish what was started, he said quietly, "You should have done it 10 years ago." A rough voice answered from the dark. "You should have stayed gone." The warrior faced the voice, his expression calm, though his eyes burned with quiet fire. "I came back because what you buried isn't dead," he said. "And when the sun rises, the truth will too." The man didn't reply. The sound of retreating footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only the wind and the steady beating of his heart. He turned his gaze toward the town below. Dry Creek slept under the pale light of dawn, unaware that the storm it feared had already begun. He mounted his horse and rode down the hill slowly, every breath of wind reminding him that some truths could not stay hidden forever. In the stillness before sunrise, the first light touched the desert floor, casting long shadows that reached across the land like restless memories. And somewhere deep inside him he knew by the time the next night came, the past would no longer be silent. The morning came with a strange stillness, the kind that made even the roosters slow to crow. The town of Dry Creek looked the same as it always did, dust hanging in the air, sun creeping over rooftops, but something unseen lingered. Folks went about their chores quieter than usual, glancing toward the main street every few minutes, half expecting trouble to roll in with the wind. The Apache warrior's return had stirred more than memories. It had awakened something that people thought time had buried for good. Inside the saloon, talk brewed like cheap whiskey. A few men gathered near the bar, speaking low. "He's asking questions," one said, tapping his glass against the counter. "The kind that dig up old bones." Another man leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "He won't stop till he finds what he's after. And if he does, some of us are going to wish he hadn't." The barkeep said nothing, only wiped the counter in slow circles, pretending not to hear. Did his eyes betrayed what his mouth didn't fear. Outside, the sheriff crossed the street, his boots raising soft clouds of dust. He found the warrior standing near the blacksmith's, watching a group of children chase each other past the well. The sight made something flicker behind his eyes, a brief softness before the mask returned. "You're making folks nervous," the sheriff said, his tone steady but guarded. "This town's had enough ghosts without stirring up new ones." The warrior turned to him. "I didn't bring the ghosts," he said quietly. "They were already here." The sheriff sighed, pulling off his hat. "Maybe, but you being here is like lighting a fire in dry grass. It's only a matter of time before it spreads." The warrior's voice didn't rise, but there was strength in it. "Sometimes fire's the only way to clear what's rotten." The sheriff studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly. "That's what you're planning. You best be ready for what it burns." Then he walked away, his shadow stretching long behind him. That afternoon, the woman from the general store closed early. Her hands trembled as she locked the door. She had seen him again that morning, standing by the well with the same quiet presence that once made her feel safe. But now safety felt far away. She carried the silver pendant in her palm, tracing the worn edges like a prayer. In her heart, she knew the storm wasn't just about him. It was about the lie that had kept them both breathing all these years. She remembered that night vividly. The fire had started near the North Ridge, spreading faster than anyone could stop it. People shouted, animals panicked, and gunfire cracked through the smoke. When it was over, bodies lay scattered, and someone whispered that the Apache had done it. Fear did the rest. She had tried to speak once to tell what she saw, but the sheriff's men were already on their horses, and the warrior was gone. She never saw who truly lit the fire, but she had seen something she'd never forgot, the flash of a familiar face in the flames, one that didn't belong to the Apache at all. Now, as she stood alone in her shop, she realized that truth was creeping closer every hour. Someone else in town knew it too, someone who didn't want it found. Out near the edge of Dry Creek, the scarred man rode hard through the scrubland. He reached a small cabin hidden among the rocks, its roof sagging with age. Inside, a figure waited by the window, sharpening a knife. "He's back," the scarred man said breathlessly. "He's asking questions about the fire." The other man looked up, his face half hidden in shadow. "Then you'd better make sure he doesn't find answers." The scarred man frowned. "You can't stop him, not after what we did." The figure stood, the knife catching the light. "I've stopped worse." The scarred man hesitated, his voice cracking slightly. "If the truth comes out, it won't just be him you'll answer to. The whole town will turn on us. Then we make sure it doesn't come out," the man said coldly. "We did what we had to. People forget that part. But if he starts digging, we'll remind them who they should fear." The scarred man swallowed hard and nodded, though unease lingered in his eyes. By sunset, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of sage and dust through the town. The warrior stood outside the livery stable, watching the horizon. He could sense it, the resistance building, the lies tightening like a snare. The land had a way of showing its truth to those who belonged to it, and he belonged to this desert more than anyone in Dry Creek ever would. He knew someone had framed him, turned the fire into a weapon to divide his people and the settlers. But he didn't know why or who had gained from it. He remembered a promise made long ago under the stars, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. That promise was the only reason he had come back. But as he looked toward the town, he saw faces full of fear, not trust. Maybe the years had changed more than he realized. Later that night, he went to the graveyard again. The wind howled low, rustling the dry grass. He knelt by the grave, whispering words in his native tongue. "They still fear what they don't understand," he said softly. "I will find who did this. And when I do, there will be no more hiding." Behind him, soft footsteps approached. He turned, hand instinctively going to his knife, but stopped when he saw her standing there. Her hair blew loose in the wind, her face pale in the moonlight. She looked older than he remembered, but her eyes held the same warmth. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Neither should you," she answered quietly. "They'll come after you if you keep asking questions." "They already did once," he said. "It didn't stop me then." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You're looking for something that can destroy what little peace we have left." He met her eyes, calm and unflinching. "Peace built on lies isn't peace." Her breath caught, and for a moment, the years between them disappeared. "You don't know what really happened," she whispered. "Then tell me," he said. But before she could answer, a sharp sound cracked through the night, a rifle shot echoing off the rocks. The bullet struck the ground near his feet, kicking up dust. He grabbed her arm and pulled her behind the oak tree. The echo faded, replaced by silence. Whoever had fired didn't wait to see if they'd hit. She looked at him with wide eyes. "They don't want the truth coming out," she said shakily. He scanned the darkness. "Then we're getting close." After a long silence, she spoke again, her voice breaking. "If you keep digging, you'll uncover more than you want to know." He looked at her, his tone softer now. "I came back to finish what was started. I can't stop now." She turned away, tears glinting in the moonlight. "Then you'll end up just like before, alone, hunted, blamed for something you didn't do." He didn't answer. The silence between them said, "Enough." By morning, word spread that gunfire had been heard near the graveyard. Some said the warrior had been ambushed. Others whispered that it was a warning. Either way, fear took deeper root. The sheriff rode out to the hill, but found nothing except footprints and a single bullet casing glinting in the dirt. He pocketed it quietly, his jaw set. That day, he went to the saloon, calling the scarred man outside. "You were close to the fire back then," the sheriff said. "I want the truth this time." The scarred man's eyes darted nervously. "It was 10 years ago. What difference does it make now?" "It makes all the difference," the sheriff said. "If lies built this town, we're standing on sand." The scarred man hesitated, then shook his head. "You don't want to know what really happened?" "Maybe not," the sheriff said. but he does. And if I don't find out, he will. The scarred man's expression tightened, fear flashing across his face. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving the sheriff with more questions than answers. That evening, the warrior returned to town, walking straight into the saloon. Every eye turned toward him. He scanned the room slowly, his voice low but firm. 10 years ago, someone lit that fire. It wasn't my people. It was one of yours. A heavy silence followed. No one moved. No one spoke. Then from the far corner a man muttered, "You got no proof." "Not yet," the warrior said. But I will." He turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind him. The sound echoed through the saloon like a closing warning. Outside, the sky burned with the last colors of sunset. The woman stood near the edge of town, watching him disappear down the road again. The sheriff stepped beside her. "He's stirring up things best left buried," he said quietly. She didn't look away. Maybe they should have never been buried at all. The sheriff sighed, his gaze following the warrior's fading silhouette. "If he keeps digging, this town's going to split wide open. Then maybe it's time it did," she said. The sheriff didn't answer. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, though the sky was clear. The wind carried the sound like a warning, and everyone in Dry Creek could feel it. Storm that had started 10 years ago was finally coming back around. The next few days passed with the kind of tension that hung in the air like the smell of rain before a storm. Dry Creek had grown restless. People spoke in whispers, doors stayed locked earlier than usual, and strangers' faces drew suspicious eyes. The Apache warrior's return had unsettled everyone. Some feared him, some pitied him, and a few quietly hoped he would uncover what they themselves were too afraid to face. The truth had been buried for a decade, but now it stirred beneath the surface, clawing its way toward the light. He spent his days walking the outskirts of town, following trails long thought forgotten. The wind carried faint traces of smoke, old fire mixed with newer secrets. He visited the ridges where the blaze had started, tracing the shape of the burnt land with his fingers. Beneath the ashes and sand, he found something, a rusted piece of metal shaped like a rifle casing. It wasn't Apache-made, it was the kind settlers used. He turned it in his hand, the faint marking still visible under the dirt. His jaw tightened. The fire that destroyed so much hadn't started from an attack. It had started from within. That evening, he rode back into town. The saloon lights glowed faintly against the deepening dusk, and the piano music faltered when he walked through the door. He placed the casing on the bar in front of the barkeep. "This came from the ridge," he said quietly. Where it began, the barkeep froze, eyes darting toward the back of the room, where the scarred man sat with 2 others. The warrior didn't look back, but his voice carried across the room. "Tell me who used these rifles that night." No one answered. The piano man's fingers hovered over the keys, waiting. The scarred man shifted in his seat, the edge of guilt flickering across his face. "You're stirring up old pain," he said finally. "Leave it be." The warrior turned, his expression calm but unyielding. Pain doesn't die when it's buried. It grows. The scarred man stood, the air between them heavy. "You don't know what you're walking into. You weren't the only one who lost that night." "I lost everything," the warrior said. "My name, my people, my place among them, but someone gained from it. I'm going to find out who." The scarred man's hand twitched near his belt, but the barkeep spoke quickly. "Not here, not tonight." The warrior stepped back, his gaze never leaving the man's. "Tomorrow," he said, "we finish what was started." Then he turned and walked out, the door swinging closed behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Outside, the night was dark and windless. The woman waited near the well, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. When he saw her, he slowed, sensing the weight in her eyes. "They'll come for you," she said softly. "You're pushing them too hard." "They've had 10 years to speak," he said. "I'm done waiting." She reached into her pocket and held out something small and folded a faded letter. "You need to see this." He took it carefully. The paper was old, the writing uneven. As he unfolded it, her voice broke. "It was left on my door the morning after the fire. I never told anyone. It said not to ask questions. It said the fire was a mistake, that someone tried to drive you out before things went too far. But it didn't go as planned." His eyes moved across the page, every word cutting deeper. Who wrote it? He asked. She shook her head. There's no name, only the sheriff's seal on the bottom corner. He looked up sharply. The sheriff. I don't know if he wrote it, she said quickly, but it came from his office. That's why I stayed quiet. I thought it was meant to protect us all. The warrior folded the letter again, tucking it into his coat. Protection built on lies always ends in more loss. Before she could answer, a voice echoed from across the street. You shouldn't have shown him that. The scarred man stepped from the shadows, rifle raised. The woman gasped, but the warrior stood still. You were there, the warrior said. The man's voice trembled with anger and something close to regret. You think you know what happened? You don't. We were told the Apache were coming for us. We thought we were defending the town. But when the flames spread, it was too late to stop it. Who told you? The warrior asked, his tone even. The man hesitated. Someone in this town who wanted peace their own way? Someone who knew fear would bring the people together? And you believed him? The man's eyes flicked toward the sheriff's office, then back to the warrior. I didn't know what else to believe. Before the warrior could press further, the man swung his rifle down. You should leave before this gets worse. There are others who will make sure you never speak again. The woman's voice cracked. Please don't do this. The scarred man hesitated, lowering the rifle slightly. You both need to forget this. Nothing good comes from digging up the past. The warrior's gaze was steady. The past isn't done with us yet. The man backed away, vanishing into the night, leaving the faint echo of his boots on the dirt road. The woman turned to him, trembling. What are you going to do? Find who started it, he said simply, and finish it before they finish me. By dawn, the whole town buzzed with unease. The sheriff walked the street, his badge glinting under the sun. He had heard the gunfire again and the whispers that followed. He knew things were sliding out of his control. He found the warrior waiting by the well, his expression calm but watchful. You've been busy, the sheriff said. I found this, the warrior replied, handing him the letter. It bears your seal. The sheriff studied it quietly. Where did you get this? It was left for her, he said, nodding toward the general store. It tells me someone tried to erase what really happened. The sheriff's jaw tightened. I didn't write it, but it came from your office. The sheriff looked down, the weight of memory pressing on him. I remember that night. I remember the fire spreading faster than any man could stop it. I remember men shooting into the dark, thinking they were protecting their families. He paused. But I also remember someone giving the order to fire first. The warrior waited. Phew! The sheriff met his eyes, torn between duty and truth. If I tell you, there'll be blood. Maybe more than this town can bear. There already has been, the warrior said. The sheriff closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. Meet me at the ridge tonight. I'll show you what's left. That night, the sky was restless, clouds crawling over the moon. The ridge loomed ahead, black and jagged, the same place where everything began. The warrior arrived first, his horse tied near a fallen log. He waited in the darkness, the letter in his pocket and the weight of 10 years pressing against his chest. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow alive with possibility. After a long silence, the sheriff appeared, lantern in hand. His steps were slow, cautious. It started here, he said, his voice low. We're told your people were coming to take back the land. I sent a group of men to warn the settlers. But someone I trusted used that fear to set the fire before dawn. I said it would drive them off before blood was spilled. The warrior's voice was steady. Who? The sheriff hesitated, looking out over the dark valley. It's the one who owned the land we stand on, the one who stood to gain from it. He built this town from the ashes of that night. The warrior's expression darkened. He still lives here. The sheriff nodded. He's the man sitting in that saloon every night, pretending to forget. He's the reason you were hunted. A rustle behind them made both men turn. The scarred man stepped into the light, his rifle gleaming. Shouldn't have told him, he said coldly. The sheriff reached for his gun, but the man fired first, the shot tearing through the quiet. The lantern fell, glass shattering, flames spilling across the ground. The sheriff dropped to one knee, clutching his arm. The warrior moved fast, tackling the gun from the man's hand. The two struggled in the dirt, the firelight flickering across their faces. You don't understand, the scarred man gasped. If he goes down, this town falls with him. The warrior's grip tightened. Then maybe it should. They fought until the gun slid across the ground. The warrior pinned him, their faces inches apart. Who gave the order? The man hesitated, sweat and blood mixing on his face. The same man who promised to protect us all. The sheriff groaned, leaning against a rock. He's talking about the mayor. The name hit like a thunderclap. The warrior froze for only a heartbeat, then released the man, standing slowly. The truth was there, heavy and undeniable. The mayor had lit the spark that burned their lives apart. The sheriff looked up, pain etched deep into his face. He used fear to build this town. He'll kill to keep it standing. The warrior turned toward the valley where the town lights flickered faintly in the distance. Then that's where it ends. The scarred man pulled himself up, voice shaking. You'll never make it back alive if he knows you're coming. The warrior mounted his horse, the firelight dancing across his face. He already knows. And as he rode down toward Dry Creek, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of smoke once more. As if the desert itself remembered what it had promised not to forget. The night air was thick as the warrior rode down the slope toward Dry Creek. The town lights shimmered faintly in the distance, trembling like a reflection on water. Every step of his horse seemed heavier, burdened by what he now knew. The mayor, the man who had rebuilt the town and played the role of savior, was the one who had lit the fire that destroyed so many lives. The truth was ugly, but it had to come out, no matter how many years had passed. When he reached the edge of town, the streets were quiet. The saloon stood open, light spilling across the wooden porch. A few men stood near the doorway, their hands resting close to their holsters, but their eyes betrayed unease. Word had already spread. The sheriff had been seen bleeding at the ridge, and people whispered that the warrior was coming for justice. No one dared to stop him as he dismounted and walked toward the saloon. The door creaked open under his hand, and the hum of silence filled the room. The mayor sat at his usual table near the back, a glass of whiskey in front of him. His coat was neat, his silver hair combed, his face calm. But when he saw the warrior, his expression flickered with something sharp and defensive. "You've stirred up quite a storm," he said quietly. "People are scared again. I thought you'd had enough of that." The warrior stepped closer, placing the letter on the table between them. "You wrote this?" he said. The mayor glanced at it and gave a small nod. "I did what I had to do. This town was dying before that night. There was no law, no safety, no order. I built Dry Creek out of chaos. You built it from ashes that you made," the warrior said. "You burned lives for your order." The mayor's voice hardened. "Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. You think anyone here would have stayed if they knew the truth? They needed someone to blame. And you, your people, were convenient." The warrior's fists clenched, but his voice stayed steady. "You lied to them. You used fear to control them." The mayor stood, his tone turning sharp. They listened. They followed. They obeyed. Because fear works, hope doesn't. The room stayed silent, every eye fixed on them. The barkeep stopped polishing glasses. The piano player's hands hovered uncertainly above the keys. The warrior took a slow breath. "Can't keep ruling through fear. Not anymore." The mayor laughed softly, though it sounded hollow. "You think the truth will set them free?" "No. It'll destroy them. It'll undo everything I built." "Then maybe it wasn't worth building," the warrior said. Outside footsteps echoed. The sheriff entered, his arm bandaged, his face pale from blood loss but his eyes clear. "He's right," the sheriff said. "The town deserves to know." The mayor turned sharply. "You've already done enough damage, Sheriff. Go home before you ruin yourself." But the sheriff didn't move. "I've lived with guilt long enough. It's time this ended." The warrior stepped back as the sheriff faced the room. 10 years ago, he began, his voice heavy but firm. The fire that destroyed the ridge wasn't started by an attack. It was lit by men under orders. Orders from this man, he pointed at the mayor. We were told it would protect the town. Instead, it burned families, homes, and a future we could have shared. A murmur spread through the room, disbelief mixed with anger. The mayor's calm cracked. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "I saved this town. Without me, none of you would have anything." But no one spoke for him. The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. People who had trusted him now looked at him like a stranger. The warrior turned and walked out, the sheriff following close behind. The mayor didn't stop them. He just stood there, staring into his glass as if it could explain what he'd done. Outside, dawn was starting to touch the sky. The woman waited near the well, just as before. When she saw them, her eyes filled with tears. "Is it over?" she asked. "Almost," the warrior said. "They know now. The truth belongs to them." She nodded slowly, her hands trembling. "He'll lose everything. He already lost his soul," the sheriff said quietly. The sun began to rise, spreading a soft gold light over the dusty streets. People started gathering, whispering, asking questions, piecing the story together. Some cried, some stood in stunned silence. It wasn't the kind of victory anyone celebrated. It was a wound reopened, but this time, one that could finally heal. Later that morning, the sheriff stood on the steps of the old courthouse. "There'll be a trial," he told the townsfolk.
How?
"No more lies, no more hiding. We'll do this right." The warrior stayed back, watching the faces in the crowd. He saw the woman holding her son, the blacksmith wiping his hands on his apron, the schoolteacher shaking her head in disbelief. These were people who had lived under a shadow they didn't even know existed. And now, with the truth in the open, they were free to face it. The sheriff walked over. "You did what you came to do," he said. "What will you do now?" The warrior looked toward the horizon. "There's nothing left for me here, but I'll find peace somewhere. Maybe that's enough." The sheriff nodded. "You brought justice. It doesn't always come easy, but it came." The warrior gave a faint smile. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's just about truth. As he prepared to leave, the woman approached, her eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. "You could stay," she said softly. "Start over here. You've earned it." He shook his head gently. "The place isn't here. This town needs to find its own way." "And so do I," she reached out, touching his hand briefly. "Then go with peace." He mounted his horse, the morning light gleaming across his face. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. The pain was still there, but it wasn't a chain anymore. It was a scar reminder that healing was possible. As he rode away, the town behind him began to stir with new life. The mayor was taken into custody, his voice shouting from behind barred windows, but few stopped to listen. The sheriff took charge, determined to rebuild trust. People started cleaning the old streets, repainting signs, reopening doors. The air felt lighter, as if the land itself had sighed with relief. By the time the sun reached the ridge, the warrior had already disappeared into the desert. The wind moved softly through the dry grass, carrying the smell of sage and dust. He stopped once, looking back at the distant rooftops, small and fragile against the wide sky. For all the pain it held, Dry Creek had found its truth, and that was something worth leaving behind. He turned his horse toward the horizon, where the land stretched endless and open. He didn't know where he would go, but for the first time, he didn't need to. The world was wide, and he was free to find his own place in it. Far behind him, the woman stood at the well, watching until he vanished from sight. The boy beside her tugged at her hand. Who was he? "Mama." She smiled faintly. "Someone who reminded us what courage looks like." The boy looked up at the bright sky. "Will he come back?"
Us.
She looked out toward the ridge, where the first heat shimmered off the rocks. "Maybe not," she said softly. "But what he left will stay." The town slowly healed over the following months. New crops grew where the old fields had burned. Children played in the dusty streets without fear. The sheriff led with fairness, and the people began to trust each other again. The story of the fire was no longer a secret. It became a lesson, told from one generation to the next, a story of loss, forgiveness, and the cost of silence. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, the warrior rode beneath a sky that stretched forever, carrying with him the memory of all he had lost and all he had finally let go. In his heart, there was no vengeance left, only peace, and the quiet knowing that truth once spoken never truly dies. In the end, Dry Creek stood not because it was built on power, but because it learned to stand on truth. And that was the kind of foundation that could never again be burned away.